Welcome to the second lecture on comparative politics. In this lecture, we're going to look at the methodology of comparative politics, usually called the comparative method. We're also going to touch upon some other issues in empirical analysis. Namely, we're going to look at the difference between normative and empirical analysis. Normative analysis is something we might do in political philosophy, looking at the values of a system. Empirical analysis looks at the facts and says, well, we're going to bracket some of these normative concerns for a while. So we're also going to get into a little of the background, why philosophers have, why these are issues in empirical analysis and why the history of these ideas. We're going to look at the comparative method, and finally we're going to talk about what actually differs across country. What are we comparing when we're comparing two countries? So without further ado, let's look at the signposting. The first question we're going to look at is the difference between normative and empirical analysis. The second one, we're going to look at the basic strategies of social research, meaning not just in political science, but in the social sciences more generally, including psychology, economics, sociology, and history. What are some of the basic strategies we use to look at social phenomena, whether it's a psychological issue or whether it's an economic issue? And how does the comparative method fit within this array of social research strategies? And finally, we're going to look at what comparativists actually compare when they're comparing. So one of the basic divides in political science is this difference between normative and empirical analysis. And these are two fundamental approaches. Normative analysis asks the question, how should people act? With the emphasis on should. And when this goes into comparative analysis, the question is, what is the best form of government? Meaning that we're not just looking at comparing governments that actually exist, but we're trying to think out what would be the best government according to some set of values, whether it be liberty, justice, democracy, etc. Now, there is really no best government, at least not on the planet. The best government is some absolute standard, an abstract standard we have in our minds. So what's happening when we're doing normative analysis, we're looking at existing political institutions and we're comparing them against some absolute standard. For example, if we look at democracies, we would ask, well, which democracy comes close according to the standard of a perfect democracy? No democracy is a perfect democracy. All deny some rights. Even the most advanced and progressive democracies usually deny political rights to children, which means not everyone has a right to vote. Another feature of normative analysis is that there's an emphasis on definitions. They try to say, let's define democracy. Let's define justice. Let's define liberty. Definitions are good. They help clarify. They create concepts. But in normative analysis, they're the key because they're trying to nail down what these different things are. And once again, they're dealing with the abstract system. What is democracy? And then defining it according to the archetype. Now, when you're in empirical analysis, you're not really focused on definitions. Definitions can some get in the way. And, it's a lot of language games, and we're really trying to nail down what is actually happening on the ground. Another feature for normative analysis is that they tend to compare good versus bad. Some systems, maybe perhaps democratic, are considered good, while other systems like authoritarian systems are considered bad, just versus unjust. In this sense, democracy is always preferable to dictatorship, and capitalism would always be preferable to communism. Empirical analysis can't make those assumptions. We have to say, look, democracy might do some things well, but it might not do other things well. For example, a democracy might not be the best to promote economic development. And when we're doing an empirical analysis, we can't be blind to the fact that democracies might have some really attractive characteristics for normative reasons, but they might be ineffective in achieving some of their policy goals. A fourth aspect is deductive. And deductive means you start with definitions, a little bit like geometry. You start with definitions, you start with givens, and you start making logical deductions based upon these assumptions that you make. So, for example, if this, then that. And this is, once again, a very abstract method. It doesn't actually touch upon looking at real economic or real political systems. So, just to sum up, normative analysis puts an emphasis on values. It puts an emphasis on prescription, which means prescribing what governments should do. And it also tends to be abstract, dealing with not European democracy, not American democracy, but with the most general level, what is democracy in general, not actually anything in particular. Empirical analysis basically says, look, normative analysis has its place, but it doesn't really get us to where we want to be. We don't want to know how people should act. We want to know how people do act. How do people act, for example, in German elections? How do, let's say, Japanese leaders make foreign policies? I'm not trying to judge them, I'm trying to explain their behavior. Now, this means we're not asking what is the best form of government, we're looking for what is the better form of government. So we're comparing a real government with another real government. So we might ask, for example, what is more democratic? French democracy or German democracy? And we find ways to define this. For example, what percentage of the public votes in elections? What is the turnout rate? How many different parties are allowed to contend? Are there restrictions on candidates or, for example, voting? And this allows us to make a comparison. Neither one is perfect, but we can maybe assess which one is doing a better job according to some criteria. Now, the other one about that is that empirical analysis puts emphasis on causality, which means what correlates with democracy, and not just correlates, which appears with democracy, what causes what. For example, we might ask, does capitalism increase the chances of a democratic system being stable? Or is it democracy that permits capitalism? These are going for cause and effect relationships, not, for example, which system is better. So the emphasis on the scientific method and, let's say, empirical analysis isn't good versus bad, but a factual determination, true versus false. Another way of describing this is the inductive approach. We look at real systems, we look at real particulars, and we then make empirical generalizations. We say, look, I see a pattern in the, let's say, the things that we're studying. If I was a natural scientist, maybe studying leaves, I would take a different sample of leaves from different trees and then look at their common characteristics and then make a generalization, instead of starting with an abstract concept in my head and then applying it to real phenomena. Once again, how do governments really behave? And if you had to say what are the three key words, empirical analysis focuses on facts. It is not prescriptive about what people should do. It is trying to describe how people do, what do people really do, and also to tie down cause versus effect. If this happens, what can we likely expect? And ultimately, it's not about dealing with abstract things, it's dealing with applied policies. In the sense, let's talk about real policies that are somewhat imperfect, and that's the focus of empirical analysis. There's also a thing about what's called the division between facts and norms, and why there's a preference for dealing with facts in empirical analysis, and particularly comparative politics. The first one is something that goes back to the sociologist Max Weber, which is that you can't derive facts from values. I may want something to be true, but that can't make it true. It's not what we want, it's how the world is. And a lot of this goes back to that, the road to hell, as the cartoon says, is paved with good intentions. Just because we want them, or we desire justice, or we desire democracy, or we desire equality, or any of those things, does not actually make us choose the best policies. And very often we have very good, personal, virtuous people leading very ineffective and poor governments. The Latin saying there is, if sic vis pacem, para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. Sometimes when you want good outcomes, it means you're going to do some things that are not particularly virtuous to achieve that. Some real-world examples include the end of apartheid. When it ended in 1994 in South Africa, the ending of apartheid was undoubtedly a great thing, but one of the criticisms of the ANC regime after the end of apartheid is that it hasn't been particularly good in promoting economic development and growth for the citizens of South Africa, whether white or black. Another quip is that during fascism in the 1920s and 30s, people said, well, Mussolini is not a particularly nice guy, but he is effective, he gets the trains to run on time. Facts, though, can inform our values, because they can tell us the likely consequences of our choices. If you make this choice, if you adopt, for example, a majoritarian electoral system, if you adopt a certain economic policy, I can probably inform you about what's likely to occur and therefore give you something to weigh the consequences of one choice versus another. A famous comparison is the choice to adopt democracy versus, let's say, authoritarian, particularly military regimes, and how that promoted or hindered economic growth. After World War II, in Latin America and India, were pretty robust democracies. Obviously, in Latin America, you went from democracy to military government back and forth, but there was basically an emphasis on democracy, at least in certain parts of the region. And what you observed for the most part was relatively slow economic growth. Now, I'm generalizing over a very long period of time, but basically much slower. In East Asia, particularly South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, you had military or very authoritarian governments, but they were able to pursue relatively good economic policies and experience a high rate of economic growth and a high level of economic development over the same period. So, given that, you might, let's say, question the choice to adopt political reforms that lead to democracy if you are, let's say, a military regime or authoritarian regime. A lot of this also goes back to the idea that comparative politics is a science, just like the physical and the natural sciences. And values tend to bias your analysis. You can have things like self-fulfilling prophecies. Because you believe something to be true, it actually becomes true, or what we call wishful thinking. Scientific analysis ideally should be value neutral. And that means when you're studying politics, you can't necessarily favor democracies if democracies aren't ineffective in certain areas. Another part to this is that something that the economist Paul Krugman has said, that you need to have an outlook that says you need to learn from the Gentiles, meaning that you have to listen to people who disagree with you. And sometimes bad leaders and bad governments do good things. They do some of the things about government were adopted under corporatist or fascist governments. Not that we want fascism or these corporatist governments, but we can look at some of their policies, and some of them were actually relatively forward and have been adopted by other governments. If we completely ignore them or just use guilt by association, we're not able to get the full value of analyzing politics across the world. Now, these concerns actually go back as far back to the origins of political analysis. And the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once said, all Western thought is basically a footnote to Plato and Aristotle, and in comparative politics, it's no different. And both Plato and Aristotle had something to say about political analysis. And it's a particular contrast in styles. In the center, you see a detail from Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens, with Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. Both philosophers take on the issue of political analysis, Plato most famously in a book called The Republic, and Aristotle in a book called The Politics. And they pose a similar question. In Plato's Republic, Plato has Socrates pose the question, what is justice? Or the question is posed to Socrates. And Socrates basically says, well, let's think about a perfect society. He basically constructs a utopian thought experiment. What would a perfect government look like? And you can see this in the painting because Plato gestures upward. He says we should evaluate politics by the absolute standard, and then we can see how well Athens stacks up against our absolute standard of what is perfect cosmic justice. Aristotle poses similar questions, but he really disagrees with his teacher Plato's approach. And if you ever read the Politics, he often makes little quips at Plato saying, well, Plato made this great assumption, and he can assume whatever he likes, however, it doesn't make it so. And Aristotle, if you look at his political analysis, he basically collected the constitutions of all the governments throughout the ancient world and started to compare them and ask which systems work better, which ones are more stable, which ones are more prosperous. And you can see in the painting, Aristotle gestures downward, puts his hands toward the earth, suggesting that if you want to find truth, you need to look at the particulars of individual governments. And if you look closer at this picture, Plato's holding a book called the Timaeus, which basically says everything can be reduced to geometry, while Aristotle holds a book called Ethics, which encourages a practical approach to analyzing human behavior. Now, another one who's very key in kind of pushing this idea of a scientific approach to politics is Niccolo Machiavelli. And you probably encountered him in your global history and geography class, and you probably had the phrase, the end justifies the means, beaten into your head quite a bit. But Machiavelli is kind of an heir to the Aristotelian view of how to look at politics. He advocates realism. And because in the Middle Ages, leading before Machiavelli, there was often the questions about what is a just war, what is a just and good ruler, and more or less taking a page from Plato. Machiavelli basically constantly repeats, I would say, his famous but statement. And he goes in many different places in The Prince and his other writings as well. It would be really nice if people were nice. And if they were, we could be nice too. But he says, but we know they're not. And that's being realistic. And because we know other people aren't nice, we know they're selfish and sometimes mean and sometimes don't listen to the better angels of their nature. It is a better policy to be mean. He also kind of poses this difference between ends, meaning goals, meaning values, and the means to achieve these values. Machiavelli says, look, I can't judge your goals, I can't judge your values, right? Different strokes for different folks. But if you tell me what your values are, I can maybe give you some answers about what is the best way to go and achieve them. Because I can look at actual politics, make factual observations, and then use that to, let's say, what is a better way to defend your country? And one of the questions that Machiavelli actually goes to, not so much in The Prince, is whether it's better to hire mercenaries or use a citizen militia. Which one will provide more security for the city-state? And he basically concludes that mercenaries are not trustworthy, and you should base your government and your security policy based on a citizen militia because they will fight for your country. They will not abandon you in your time of need. So there's in the modern day, three kind of basic approaches to social analysis: the experimental mode, the historical mode, and what we might call the statistical mode. The experimental method is basically what you find often in psychology. What it does, it takes all the observations, it randomly assigns them to two groups. By randomly assigning them, they kind of wash out all the differences. You divide these groups into the control group, which gets no treatment, and a test group, which gets some treatment. So, for example, the graphic you see on the right is the famous one about using citrus to combat scurvy in the sailors in the British Navy. The control group didn't get any citrus, the experimental group did. And then you see, well, one group continued to get scurvy, the other one didn't. You can therefore conclude that the citrus had an impact on whether one got scurvy, and you basically confirm the effectiveness of citrus in combating scurvy. Because what you do is you put them in the group and then you observe the differences between the group, but it's important to note that this starts with a theory. There is a hypothesis that goes there. I think that citrus will combat scurvy. How could I tell if this theory is true? And then you create a set of observations in an artificial thing by controlling two groups and then observing whether the proposed difference actually develops. The historical method is a little bit different. The historical method focuses on chronology, which means it's really a before or after. This led to this, led to this. And therefore, the emphasis is very much on specific causes and effects. Why did they have this policy? Who made the decision? What were different views? Or what was in the mind of decision makers? And there's also an emphasis on process, which means process is more than just cause and effect, but outlining step by step of how things occurred. For example, how did the decision to go to the war in Vietnam actually occur? Who was part of those decisions? What information were they considering? And an attempt to reconstruct that. The key part in historical method is the counterfactual, which means we know what actually happened in history. A counterfactual is basically a what-if question. What if something didn't happen? Can we construct the imaginary timeline and then compare the imaginary timeline with actual events? But this is basically going from observation to theory. We see how things really occurred, and based on observations, what happened in the historical stream, we try to create a theory about what explains why countries do what they do. The final one is statistical methods, which you often find in sociology and also in economics, which basically takes a lot of observations, arrange them in variables, and then looks for patterns in these statistically significant relationships between the variables. And a lot of this is about the average tendency of groups. On average, okay, if you increase democracy, how much more economic growth are you likely to see? So once again, using math, using the standard statistical significance, and looking for patterns in variation, which means you need countries to be varied so you can get many different levels of a particular thing. So for example, if you wanted to see the impact of democracy, you couldn't just look at democracies. You have to look at strong democracies, moderate democracies, weak democracies, and also non-democracies. Because unless you have all that variation, you're not going to be able to tell what is the strength of democracy on the outcome you're looking at. And also, like historical analysis, this is going from observation. We look at the variation across the world, not over time, but maybe over space, and saying, well, do countries that are more democratic, do they have higher rates of economic growth? Are countries that less democratic have lower rates of economic growth? So the comparative method tries to borrow from all three. But each of these poses a problem for comparative politics, in part because the limitations of studying countries. So in some ways, they have a modified or adapted version of these methods when we look at comparative politics. So the problems with the experimental method is basically it's impossible. The world is not a controlled laboratory. We cannot randomly assign countries to one group or another. And in part, it's not a laboratory because countries interact with each other. They're not going to be separate into two groups. Russia will still border China even if I put it into two separate groups, and therefore there's going to be a taint going on that's going to, let's say, contaminate this controlled experimental design. Second part, even if we actually could do that, if let's say, for example, we had our time machine, it would be unethical. Are you going to randomly assign someone to a totalitarian country just to see what the impact is? That raises a lot of ethical questions about whether that's a good research question. But what comparative politics try to do is take advantage of what we call natural experiments. Sometimes policies or events create the separation into two groups, and we can kind of track the streams from one point in time. So just to use a few examples, recently there was a referendum on Scottish independence. If they had declared themselves independent, we might have been able to basically compare the path of Wales versus Scotland. Scotland, a country that chose independence, Wales, a country that did not, but have a similar position, a similar size, and a similar level of economic development. And we could maybe track, for example, what would happen with their monetary or economic policy given their relationship to England and to the European Union. We had another natural experiment because of the events of 1989 with the end of communism. We saw countries that are relatively similar choose different policies about how to transition out of communism to, let's say, something that looks like democracy and capitalism. In Russia, they emphasized political reforms first, what you might often have heard as glasnost, and then economic reforms second, perestroika. China, a similarly large country with a similar communist background, chose economic reform first under Deng Xiaoping, and only later, and some people would say not yet even, have looked at political reform. So how have these two different sequences of developing or transitioning from communism worked? And we can compare Russia and China in a way. Another example is when there's a large event that affects many different countries at the same time, such as the 2008 financial crisis. There's variation across countries. Effectively, they've assigned themselves to different groups, but they got the same treatment, i.e. they all experience a relatively large economic crisis. How did different countries respond based on different characteristics of these countries? The historical method basically says, look, the problem, we look at the history's background, we see how decisions are made, we see how different policies are adopted, and we can basically go into the historical record and kind of create the cause and effect that we're looking for by looking at a few countries very carefully. Some of the problems is that history basically tells us that every country is fundamentally unique, and when things are unique, they're not comparable. Things have to have some things in common if you're going to compare them, and if everyone's unique, well, comparison really goes out the window. A second one is that historical method emphasizes variation over time, meaning how things change from the past to the present, and don't look at variation over space, meaning to looking at countries in one point in time, okay, but in different parts of the world or different choices. Some other problems that you face is that when you look back into the past, there can often be very poor data, especially if you're not a developed country, and as a result, you can only go back so far, and then the data starts getting spotty. So we would really like to study the democracies of, let's say, the 1800s, but the data on elections isn't as strong as the data in the 20th century, or really the data since World War II, and therefore we kind of run into a dead end because the evidence won't support any type of theory we're testing. But what we do is sometimes have a critical case study. There might be one country that basically is the exception to the rule, and because it's a historical outlier, it might give us some insight into processes. A good example of this is the country of Japan. Culturally, Japan belongs in Asia and shares the Confucian Buddhist tradition that most of Asia shares. And so if you're testing culture versus institutions, it can be interesting because it shares the culture of Asia, but it has the level of economic development and institutions that are very similar to Western Europe. So the point is, which one will be more important? The cultural historical background, or the choice of institutions, or the level of development? So Japan can be often a very good lever to get at questions because it didn't develop within Europe, and in some ways it's a counterfactual in itself, an alternate history to development. The statistical method has some advantages and it's used in comparative politics, but it can also mean it might not be the most informative thing because the average effect might be unimportant. So, for example, if I'm looking at the average effect of a proportional representation electoral system, that might not tell me about how the proportional representation system works in Israel, because no country is average. And just as no person is average, no observation is average. So a generalization might not help me explain the particulars of individual cases, and that might be the focus of my concern. Another problem when you're using the statistical method is that there's too few observations to achieve statistical significance. For example, if you're studying democracies, we really only have good data on 30 to 40 democracies, and that's basically just over the minimum what you need to do any major statistical analysis. Now, there are ways around this, but if you're comparing at the country level or the system level, or in a region with smaller number of countries, you might not be able to achieve statistical significance by any reasonable standard. And the final thing is that the units you're comparing aren't uniform. Okay, when you're comparing a country the size of Russia or the United States or China with a relatively small country like Belize or Uruguay or Lesotho, yes, they're countries, but they're different size, different levels of development, different culture, and therefore, when you're saying these are independent, similar units of analysis, you're really kind of stretching it quite far, and therefore statistical methods might fall apart, at least for certain types of questions in comparative politics. So we do use two different types of what we call research designs. And what comparative method tries to do is trait selective, which means we do not take random sets of countries. We select the countries particularly because they have similar characteristics or very different characteristics. So the point is that there's no randomness. There is no, let's say, random assignment as you would have in experimental methods. You're not looking at a huge data set like you might do for statistical methods. You're creating selective, structured comparisons, which means you're choosing the countries for a particular reason. You're setting up the comparison in particular ways to control for certain types of things that might affect your analysis. And what you're trying to do is do historical quasi-experiments. You're trying to take from all the data from history and create something that looks like an experiment. It's not an experiment, but at least you can claim that you somehow controlled for some of the variables that might affect the cause and effect that you're looking at. And what eventually you're trying to find are patterns of variations. So there's two basic strategies to do this, called the most different comparison and the most similar comparison. So if we look on the left, let's look at two countries that are completely different, except for one small characteristic in which they overlap. So basically they're so different, and if there's only, let's say, a few things that actually they share, perhaps the cause that you think is causing a relationship, and also, let's say, the effect or the outcome you're looking at, then you can be relatively certain that that cause is leading to that effect, because there's no other things that are overlapping. There's no other things that can overlap that could explain the common characteristic between these two different countries. So, for example, you might look at countries, a country like Botswana and the United States. The United States is an advanced, developed economy. It's democracy. Botswana is a country in the southern part of Africa. It is also democracy, but it is relatively low on the levels of economic development. It's also experienced the AIDS epidemic in a very bad way, and a lot of other things. So if you're looking at something that is, what does democracy explain, we might be able to look at these two very different countries and then look at their one shared characteristic that they're both relatively long-term robust democracies. On the other hand, you might do the most similar comparison, which means you find two countries that are basically fundamentally alike in almost every characteristic, except they're different in, let's say, one different thing. So, for example, two countries that are different because they adopted two different policies, maybe a different welfare system, maybe a different electoral system, but otherwise they're the same. Because there's only a few things different, the thing that's different must explain, let's say, the pattern and the variation. Now, the most common, most similar comparison is actually a country compared to itself over time. So, for example, you might want to compare France in 1979 with France in 1985, and then look at the policies of the Mitterrand government intervening and compare those two countries, because France will still share the same culture. They will share the same, more or less the same public and interests. But what we're doing is maybe the policies of one particular leadership group or one particular government, and see how that affects the policies going forward. And so these are two basic strategies. Now finally, we want to ask what actually varies. What are we looking for differences across country? Now this can be a lot of different things, but I think they can be generalized in three large categories, which I usually call I cube. And it's called I cube because these are three I's. You can look at differences in interests, you can look at differences in ideas, or you can look at differences in institutions. And each of these goes back to a famous old kind of ancestor comparative politics and the types of differences that they emphasize in their own research. So for interest, we can look at Machiavelli, who basically assumed that everyone was on the take, everyone is fundamentally selfish and mean. And so Machiavelli would say, look, if you want to know if you can tell me what people want and also how much power they have to achieve what they want, I can tell you what they're going to do. So when we look at countries, we might look at the size, the intensity, and the organization of interest groups. For example, how strong are labor unions in different countries? In countries where labor unions are strong, perhaps we'll have more generous social and welfare policies. Or, for example, in countries where women are relatively weak because their status is very low, we might just expect to see policies that are discriminatory or adverse to women. We might look, for example, at different key industries. What is the basis of the economy of a different country? And for a lot of countries we'll be looking at this year, they have one really key industry that matters, which is energy, or in shorter terms, oil. So if you want me to explain Saudi Arabia's policies, follow the money. Look how they're generating money, the production of oil, the price of oil, the threat to oil, competitors of oil producers is going to explain a lot of what Saudi Arabia does. The second one is de Tocqueville. And de Tocqueville wrote a famous study of the United States called Democracy in America. And he basically says, look, democracy is not a set of institutions, it's not a set of organizations, it's basically a set of values. And he described the set of values that existed in Jacksonian America, a set of habits, a set of patterns of interaction, and says, look, if you can tell me how these people think and look at the values that underlie the American system, I can explain to you how Americans are going to act, what policies they're going to choose, and more or less what is the future of the country. Ideas come into play in a lot of things, for example, about identities. So nationalism, religion, language. Different countries look at citizenship in different ways. In America, for instance, we define a citizen as anyone that's born within the borders of our country, which means we don't care about ethnicity, we don't care about your genes. We don't care about who your father or your mother was, although we do a little bit. But basically, we say, look, anyone could be born within our country. We don't care what ethnicity or language or religion you have. You can become an American. In other countries, they define their citizenship by bloodlines. They say, basically, if you want to be a citizen, you need to be able to trace your descent to a common ethnic ancestor. Germany is like this. Japan is like this. To some extent, Israel is like this, about how they determine what does it mean to be a Jewish citizen and therefore being able to claim a right of citizenship within Israel. And this goes down to people's values. Ideas can matter about things like political culture. What are the common values in a society? and what ideologies are playing. So a recent study by historian David Hackett Fisher makes a comparison of the United States and New Zealand, which might seem a strange comparison at first, other than they're both English-speaking countries. But he says, look, in the United States, when they come to political issues, they always use the concept of freedom. Whether they're on the left or the right, they both kind of use the concept of freedom to explain their ideas. But in New Zealand, they don't like the word freedom. It's not the best word. And he says, partially because of their history, New Zealanders or Kiwis talk about everything in terms of fairness. And therefore, they use a different vocabulary to describe their problems. And this can create a favoritism for certain policies or certain governments or certain types of value appeals to the public. The final is someone named Max Weber, who I've referred to before, and he emphasized things like organizations and institutions and rules. And he says, look, people can have the same interests, people can have the same ideas, but what really matters is the game they're playing. What are the rules of their game in politics? How do they count votes? How do they make governments? What are the voting rules? What type of organizations carry out policy? Are they bureaucratic, or are they more, let's say, familistic or patrimonial? So if you tell me what game people are playing, I can more or less predict what their moves are going to be and to tell you about their behavior. So tell me about their party and electoral systems. Tell me about the structure of government. Are they unitary or are they federal? Tell me about how strong the bureaucracy is. And if you give me those things, I can more or less give you a pretty good account of what their politics are going to be like. So this ends the second lecture in comparative politics. The third lecture will talk about basic concepts and definitions in terms of using comparative politics.